Welcome to you all. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. And I'm delighted that so many of you have joined us this morning for what promises to be a fascinating discussion with Senator Mark Warner on budgets and the future of the American defense industry. And then I would say and whatever he wants to say about Ukraine and energy security at the same time. So I think there's things moving. Whenever one organizes an event like this, you have the theme that you come in with, and then current events give you some audibles that you end up calling. I'm not the person who's going to introduce Senator Warner. That will be General Arnold Panaro from our board. So I won't say how much I respect his private sector background or what he's able to do as governor or the great job he's doing on the Hill. I'll leave Arnold to do all of that. But it's a great honor to have you as a longstanding member of the Atlantic Council board. And you really do stand for a lot of what the Atlantic Council stands for, which is bipartisanship, results orientation. How do we actually bring the country together to get things done? Arnold Panaro is the chairman of the National Defense Industrial Association, and I want to thank him for NDIA's co-sponsorship of this event. Let me just say a couple of things about our defense industrial policy series before we get started, through which the Atlantic Council has been trying to create, with the director of this series, Steve Grunman, the preeminent platform from which public officials address the government stewardship of the defense industrial base. And Steve's just done a terrific job with this initiative. We were able to take this on thanks to the generosity of George Lund with the M.A. and George Lund Fellowship, which is held by Steve, and it's the practice responsible for this series and work more generally about the defense industrial base of the United States. We recognize that the government's partnership with industry is a vital thread in the overall fabric of U.S. national security and the national security of our allies and partners around the globe. There's a second thing that we're looking at, and that is realizing that there's an inflection point now in this entire relationship. Things are moving. Clearly, one of the things that's making things move, and Senator Warner will talk about this, is the austere fiscal environment. He's on the Senate Committee on the Budget and especially well-positioned to address this. But in addition, there's the fact that allied militaries are now pulling back from a decade of counterinsurgency wars. We've got an election in Afghanistan coming up, withdrawals from Afghanistan coming up. You've got astonishing advances in technology that are changing military operations. And then threats, antagonists, things move, as we've been seeing in Ukraine, but also how you respond to those threats moves. I could have imagined a much different response in previous years with NATO alerts and all sorts of military threats, where in this case the weapons we're using are primarily ones of prestige and economics. So we've got a lot of questions about how business and government work together to enhance national security using all of these factors. This series is part of the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security and a further expression of what its namesake, General Brent Scowcroft, had in mind for the center. The cultivation of a transatlantic constituency for strategic thinking, which we believe there's not enough of in this town at the moment, about practical solutions for the problems of international security across the globe. I can hardly think of a voice more capable of serving up that sort of approach and practical solutions for the government's stewardship of the defense industry than Senator Warner. So with that, I'm going to pass to General Arnold Panaro. Arnold's director of the council, as I said. He would not indulge me in giving him a long introduction, so I won't. But it is terrific when you have someone who has Bronze Star, Purple Heart himself, has become quite a leader in sort of thinking about this set of issues. Of course, a legendary staff director for Senator Sam Nunn, and then many, many stops along the way in his career since then. He's the first of two Marine generals we're going to have here today. Around noontime, we'll have General Amos, the Marine Commandant, for a session here as well. So, Arnold, great to have you here.
Well, thanks, Fred. It's a privilege for me as chairman of the largest and oldest defense industry association, NDIA, joined by our CEO, General Larry Farrell, here this morning to join Fred Kemp, Steve Gunderman, the Atlantic Council, and sponsoring this on the defense industrial base, but really also Senator Warner's tremendous leadership in matters that determine what the industrial base is going to look like, which is the overall budget situation. The Atlantic Council has become a driving force in this whole area, thanks to Fred and Steve, and also with the new chairman, Governor or Ambassador Huntsman. This is a critical time, as we all know, to address these issues. So it's my privilege and pleasure to introduce Senator Mark Warner. He's a leader that hasn't shrunk from doing the right thing, even when the right thing was the most difficult thing to do. And frankly, there are not many of them in the Congress that you could say that about. Harlan Ullman is smiling because he knows that's accurate. His approach has always been bipartisan. He was a leader of the Gang of Six that tried to tackle our debt and deficit issues in a bipartisan way. Don't underestimate how tough that was for all those members to get out in front of those issues, to talk about cutting some of the sacred cows, including entitlements, including some of the military entitlements, getting our fiscal house in order. He was a leader in that area. And he was also a member of the recent budget conference that helped ease in the sequester, which would be the wrong way to tackle our long-term problems. A lot of people say to us in the defense industry, well, you don't have it so bad, it hadn't hurt that much. What a lot of people don't realize, even though it's been eased, we're still taking 70% of the reduction. So yes, there's some relief, but the relief is fairly minimal compared to the cuts. And from fiscal 12 all the way through fiscal 17, there's going to be a reduction of about $118 billion in the actual outlays, which is what the industrial base operates from. We don't operate from the budget authority. So Senator Warner has been a leader in trying to basically put in a more rational approach to tightening our belt. He's also got an extremely great, strong record of work on energy issues. And we know energy security is one of the biggest challenges facing our country and the world today. The situation in Russia and Ukraine, as Fred alluded to, demonstrates how important energy is to the geopolitical situations. It's a really big deal for the DoD, which is one of the biggest users of energy, and we've had a number of shortfalls in that area in recent years. And if you have to make up for increased costs in energy, you're going to be cutting readiness and operating funds somewhere else. So that means energy costs can threaten our short and long-term security. As I said, Senator Warner's taken a real lead on these issues. He's chair of the Alliance to Save Energy. He's passed multiple bills to reduce energy costs and increase efficiency. And for the first time in half a century, he actually held a field hearing aboard an aircraft carrier to address operational energy issues. So he knows, as we all know here and as the Atlantic Council knows, and we in industry know, we need to get more bang for the buck for the dollars that we get in the Department of Defense. And this is one area where he's been a real leader. And we have always appreciated his partnership and his thinking, and he's paid a lot of attention to our issues and done a lot of work to keep our national security strong. And as a Virginian, I'm proud to have Senator Warner tackling the hardest issues and the right issues. So it's my pleasure this morning to introduce Senator Mark Warner.
Thank you, Arnold. Thank you, Arnold. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for your kind comments and your willingness to help educate me on many of these issues. I knew about the Bronze Star. I didn't know as much about the Purple Heart. I wondered, considering some of the provocative ideas you've had about changing in the military entitlements system, whether that Purple Heart was received and which line of duty. But I am grateful for your voice and education, and for those of you who are kind of upset at some of the statements I've made about, particularly on the entitlement side. This is the gentleman who's helped educate me on those issues. Let me also thank Fred for his comments. I'm proud to have been a longtime member of the Atlantic Council Board. He was going through this nice recitation of different things I've done as senator and as governor. The The one thing I never get credit for as governor, many things I was proud of in terms of our budget and being named best managed state, best state for business, I never was able to get the one designation that I wish I'd been able to get, which was, and you know what, Mark Warner was the guy who solved the traffic problems in Northern Virginia. So yeah, that still seems to be a journey that many governors to come will probably still be grappling with. So again, my thanks to the Atlantic Council and NDIA for letting me be here today. We are going to talk about the budget, but I think it's, I want to start a little more with Ukraine. In addition to my budget committee and finance committee, banking committee, I've also had the opportunity to serve on the intelligence committee over the last couple of years, which gives me a different snapshot into the challenges we face all around the world. I have been, my personal background was in the technology field for over a dozen years, wireless communications, information technology. And while there are enormous benefits from the information revolution we've seen some, particularly recently in the last 2 to 3 years, both the information upside of nations having access to tremendous information and the enormous ability to empower populations all across the globe. But we've also seen beginnings of that, some of the instability that breeds as well. We can only look to Syria, Libya, obviously the circumstances in Ukraine, but I would also point out to nations that as recently as 3 or 4 years ago were being held up as examples of economic growth combined with emerging democracies that seem to be models, that now their very nation states are in levels of instability that would not have been predicted 2 or 3 years ago, Brazil and Turkey, for example. The conclusion that I've come to as we look, and I say this recognizing I'm speaking at the Atlantic Council and how important transatlantic relationships are, but I come to you this morning believing more than ever that it is absolutely critical, beyond critical, essential, that America maintains a strong economic, military, and moral leadership in the world. Without that kind of American leadership, we are not going to be able to see the rallying of allies and others around the world who look time and again, whether we necessarily ask for it or not, for the United States to step up and take the lead. And it concerns me when I see folks that I work with in Congress, and increasingly wide swaths of Americans, particularly younger Americans, who say, well, why do we need to be involved? Why do we need to play a role? Why is what's happening in Crimea of any importance to the United States of America? And as we see Russian troops mass on the eastern borders of Ukraine and the various scenarios that could play out from that, any of which would have dramatic effects not only upon the European economy but upon our economy as well, I think it's terribly important, Fred, that your efforts and others, we redouble that efforts to make sure that we make the case to my colleagues and to Americans writ large that America must stay involved. We must stay active. And again, that is one of the reasons why these budget debates are so critically important. If we don't have the economic strength, if we don't have the military strength, then our ability to be involved will be dramatically decreased. Again, let's talk for a couple of moments about some specific actions on Ukraine. It has been remarkable to see over the last couple of months the speed and escalation of the crisis in Ukraine. What started as a popular revolt at the Maidan, throwing out Yanukovych, setting up a new regime, and quite honestly, the response of Putin and the Russian forces, hard to imagine that we're seeing, in effect, one of the first, with the exception of the breakup of Yugoslavia, one of the first crossings of the territorial integrity of a European nation since the Second World War. I am deeply concerned with Russia's actions. which are in clear violation of existing treaties and agreements, especially the 1994 Budapest Agreement, which Russia and the United States and others promised to protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. That has already been violated. And the potential now, again, with forces massed in the east, lead to a potential much greater violation in which not only will Ukraine, but many of the nations of the former Soviet bloc, nations that we have much stronger treaty alliances with, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, I think are watching with great interest. Now, we've seen what the president has done and the administration has done so far. They have imposed sanctions on key Russian and Crimean officials and a major Russian bank. Yet these sanctions that have been imposed so far, and I know we need to leave headroom to continue to ratchet up the sanctions, but quite honestly, so far I think they've had very little effect, even to the point of being derided from the Russian side. The Senate last week did take action where we passed in a broad bipartisan support basis a aid package of approximately $1 billion that would be loan guarantees and other assistance to Ukraine to try to help that very struggling economy get through this very difficult transition time. We've seen similar actions from our European allies. I think these actions are terribly important. But beyond this direct aid, I think there are other areas that we can play a critically important national role. One of the most important and key aspects of Mr. Putin's ability to have influence over Ukraine and most of Europe, and this audience knows better than I the statistics, is the fact of the enormous dependency Ukraine and Europe has upon Russian gas and oil supplies. 50% of the gas that transfers to Western Europe passes through the pipelines in Ukraine. 30% of Germany's natural gas supplies immediately dependent upon the Russian gas supply. And while Russia has pledged to protect and maintain those supplies, we've seen as recently as January of 2009, in the midst of a cold snap, when Russian forces decided, Russian authorities basically said, we're going to spike and cut down the flow of that gas by about 20%, which had about an 18% price increase, which again showed at that moment Russia's ability to use energy as a weapon of its foreign policy. Matter of fact, just driving in this morning, I heard a report that said Gazprom was going to go ahead and jack up the prices immediately in terms of the circumstances in Ukraine. So what can we do? Well, we were talking before we were coming over what could be done either administratively by executive action or legislatively. I would hope the administration would act administratively, but if not, Senator John Hoeven, Republican senator from North Dakota, and I have put forward a proposal, and there are other pieces of existing legislation pending right there that would speed up and expedite and approve the number of American gas companies' abilities to export U.S. gas to that region. Who could have predicted 6 or 7 years ago that America would be awash in natural gas and the ability potentially to be the kind of energy independent that we've all seemed to have aspired to for so long is right now virtually within our hands. We need to be able to use these energy supplies as part of our foreign policy vis-a-vis energy security. Right now, the United States has approved 6 of the more than 20 pending applications. Our call on the administration is quite simple. Expedite and approve the balance of these pending applications, or tell us in Congress why not over the next 60 days. We believe expediting and approving the exportation of of natural gas would send, while not an immediate relief to Europe and to the Ukrainians, would send a long-term signal that we will stand with Europe, with Ukraine, and decouple Putin's ability to maintain this energy leverage point over these nations. As well, we've called for 3 other items. And one of these the President did take up during the summit last week with the EU. Make energy security a top priority in terms of EU-American relationships. Third thing we called for was a recognition that within the package of aid that we are offering to Ukraine, one area that there's some low-hanging fruit where American companies could take great advantage, and that is simply increasing Ukraine's energy productivity, or in the terminology that we'd use here in the States, increasing their energy efficiency. Because of Ukraine's enormous dependence upon cheap Russian gas and oil, Ukrainians use their energy consumption at about a 5-to-1 greater ratio than what we do in the United States of America. You talk about some of the lowest hanging fruit, having them simply increase their energy efficiency would help in a very short term, and there are wonderful American companies like Corning and others that could go over with our technology and provide immediate assistance. At the same time, the fourth thing I think we need to be looking at are more aggressive actions, potentially even looking at the reversal of the flow of those pipelines right now so that that gas could not only be sent from basically east to west, but potentially from west to east. For a short term at least, to alleviate some of the Ukrainian reliance upon those Russian natural gas and oil supplies. So energy security, point number one. Point number two, another proposal we've put forward, this time with Senator Mark Kirk from Illinois, is a little more perhaps American-focused, but I think it should be part of a package going forward. As I mentioned, I'm very supportive of the Senate and the Congress's action to send this billion-dollar aid package to Ukraine. But I do believe there needs to be some responsive actions from the new Ukrainian regime, and that is a recognition that if you look on almost any of the estimations of where cybercrime and cyber activities against America have originated over the last 4 or 5 years, Ukraine always ranks top 3 to top 8. One of the things I think that was become obvious is that the former President Yanukovych basically turned a blind eye to the type of cyber criminal activities, cyber hackers, some of them quasi-state sponsored, that were coming out of Ukraine. Many of us in this room, I won't do a show of hands, but I would say I was one of the victims of the credit card breaches that we kind of lumped into the Target breach in December. That all originated out of Ukraine. I believe that one of the contingencies of this billion-dollar aid package needs to be enhanced collaboration between American and Ukrainian law enforcement authorities on cracking down on these cyber criminals, building on where there exists very little at this point, extradition treaties to be able, if we can find those criminals and they can't be brought to justice in Ukraine, be brought to justice in America or somewhere else in the West, and recognizing that we expect and want Ukraine to join and bring further affiliation with the West, but part of that further affiliation means the rule of law, particularly in this area of cyber activities, has to be enhanced. It has to be followed. Again, this is an area that we've received a response from the administration that says they're interested. We don't need law, but we do. But if we don't see actions from the administration, we'll move forward on legislation in this area. Very, very important. Final point I want to make before we get to the budget, again, is that I'm actually somewhat surprised that the sense of potential crisis is not greater at this moment in America and throughout Europe. We have seen, basically because of candidly, a lack of having an ability to respond, and the Ukrainian Defense Forces' decision not to respond, we've seen already Russia take advantage of a territorial opportunity in terms of Crimea. The question will be, and I think history will judge us, should Russia take further action in eastern Ukraine, with the troops massed there and the rather sorry state of the Ukrainian defense forces, if we don't see reaction from NATO and the West, I think we will rue the day that we don't step up. Now, what those steps should be, how we send that message as strongly as possible, is the subject of, I think, a great deal of discussion and debate. But in a region that is rift with challenges with other nation states like Georgia and others in region, in my mind, this area presents some of the most extraordinary geopolitical challenges, I believe, of our time. And over the next 30 to 60 days, I think we will be judged by how we act and how we send as strong a message as possible that there will be dire, dire consequences should Mr. Putin further violate the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Now, to do that and to maintain that ability to have the kind of moral, economic, and military strength that allows us to draw red lines that we will actually enforce rather than simply speak about, we have to have a strong military. We have to have a strong defense budget, but I would argue not only a strong defense budget, but also a strong domestic budget as well. I am a firm believer in former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullen's comments that the greatest threat to our nation is not an external threat, but the now $17 trillion and counting debt that we carry on our balance sheet. And while in a certain sense it is great that we have had our deficit cut from $1.4 trillion a year down to only $500 billion, only in Washington would a $500 billion or $450 billion a year annual deficit be a sign of high-fiving between the political parties of what great progress we've made. I would point out that $17 trillion deficit, which it grows at a $4 billion a night, is unsustainable. And just to give you some sense, because the numbers, I get immediately chastised by my staff that I launch too budget wonky into numbers all the time. But you know, the fact is, I know this is hard to say in Washington, but facts actually do matter at some point, especially when it comes to our budget. But just to, you know, one factoid that I've put in my talking points these days that I think drives home the point, a 1%, 100 basis point increase in interest rates, which will happen. The Fed can only keep the interest rates low for so long. Increases our debt service on that debt by $120 billion a year. And that's a linear equation. You go up 200 basis points, that number doubles. Just the 1 basis point is the equivalent of creating 2 new departments of Homeland Security each year, right off the top. Now, there is some good news, and I say this from a parochial standpoint in Virginia, and we're proud of the fact in Virginia that we are the home on a per capita basis to more military personnel, more installations, and more veterans than any other state in the country. And as has been mentioned with vis-a-vis sequestration, and I called sequestration stupidity on steroids, and recall the fact that sequestration was set up to be such a stupid option, so irrational that no rational group of people would ever let it happen. Memo to future Congresses, don't set up a stupid default thinking we're going to be rational, at least on a going forward basis. But a year ago, in the midst of sequestration, we were facing in Virginia a $3.2 billion cut in ship construction, a cancellation of 9 ship repair contracts, and furloughs of 22 days. Well, all of us in the Virginia delegation pushed back on the Pentagon, and with this 2-year budget window, we were able to restore most of those cuts, 100% of the ship construction. We've kept our fleet, at least at this point, with the full 11 carriers. We've seen the furloughs cut back from 22 days to 6. The good news is that we did get this 2-year budget deal, although I have to say, as someone, Arnold, who has believed that all parts of the budget have to be subject to some level of cutback, and on entitlements and others all have to be part of the mix. One of the stupidest things about that short-term budget agreement was why in the heck, and let me say, thank goodness this was not one of the ideas that came out of me, or even out of the Senate, why you would pick military veterans' COLA issues as the first entitlement piece to cut. Once we've asked our military to fight 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and have made greater sacrifices than any other part of the American public, was beyond me in terms of stupidity. Luckily, Congress very quickly woke up to that fact, and you can see that we can get things done when we hear people's voices loud and clear, and got that fixed within about a 3-week period. But it was, again, I think, a very wrong place to start. As we said, though, that's a 2-year deal. 2016 comes back, sequestration comes roaring back. Sequestration comes roaring back with dramatic cuts to our Army, dramatic cuts to the Navy, including a great concern of ours and of whether we will refuel or actually curtail one of our carriers. And this is an issue that I fear at times with the 2-year budget. Many members of Congress have said, oh gosh, we're all done. We don't have to worry about this for a short period of time. Well, I go back again to my statistics that say that $17 trillion in debt is not going down. $4 billion a night is happening with these budget numbers as well as at previous times. The solution set, and as was mentioned, I was very proud of the group, the fact that the so-called Gang of Six, which built upon the Simpson-Bowles plan, it was not perfect. Let me assure you of this. I also think it's a little strange that I work in the only place in America where people of both parties work together or immediately called gang members. So it's the only place where being a gang member is actually a good thing. But end of the day, the framework of what has to happen is not going to change. Right now, on the total dollars we spend to Washington, only about 18 cents goes to everything on the military side. About 16 cents is all that goes to the domestic discretionary side. And let me just take a moment of what our business plan for our country looks like just on the domestic discretionary side. You guys know on the military side. That 16 cents includes everything America spends on energy, on environment, on early childhood, on education, on infrastructure, on research and development. The House budget plan, the House business plan for America, takes that 16 cents down to about 4 cents over 12 years. Now, I could quite honestly care less whether you're a Democrat or Republican. I actually have been a business guy longer than I've been a politician. My business was investing in businesses. I would never invest in a business that spent less than 5% of its revenues training and equipping its workforce, investing in plant and equipment, which for a nation is our infrastructure, and in a global economy, staying ahead of the competition, which is our research. So this is a fundamentally flawed business plan. The same kind of cuts, while not as great on the defense side, will also greatly reduce America's military footprint around the world and our ability to be that essential power that we need to be. The solution set is actually not as hard as a lot of the press makes it out to be. We need to do 2 things. On the Democratic side, we need to recognize that our entitlement programs need to be reformed. Medicare and Social Security are 2 of the greatest programs any government has ever created. But anyone on the Democratic side that refuses to acknowledge that the math doesn't work can't read a balance sheet. When I was a young person, there were 16 people working for every 1 person on retirement. Today, there are 3 people working for every 1 person on retirement. So the average of about paying in $1 and getting $3 back in terms of Medicare taxes versus Medicare payouts was fine when it was the earlier ratio. It doesn't work right now. And none of this self-corrects, so the sooner we start the entitlement reform on the Democratic side, the better. The flip side is we've got to reform our tax code in a way that also generates more revenue. The remarkable thing is on the revenue side, we don't need to go back to the bad old days of the 1990s. Although for many of us in this room, we probably recall the 1990s, the economy did pretty darn well. We simply have to look at the fact that in the early 2000s, we took on a 10-year run basis $4.5 trillion out of the revenue stream. In one of our crazy fiscal deals, the Cliff deal, I think it was, we put back about $600 billion. We cannot run the enterprise that we've called the federal government, not expand it, but we cannot run the basic enterprise we call the federal government on the revenue stream we've got right now. So through tax reform that will find ways to cut back on some of our tax expenditures, and actually I believe can lower rates, we've got to put about another $600 to $800 billion over a 10-year run period back into the revenue stream. Entitlement reform and tax reform are the two keys of getting this right. I actually believe the American people are ready for this so-called grand bargain. What has stopped it so far have been the voices on the extremes in both political parties. So as in this room, supporters of a strong American military, of supporters in this room of a strong America that works in close alliance with our friends across the Atlantic, if we're going to maintain that position, we are going to have to find this bargain point. The only thing that can stop it will be politics. And the point that Arnold made in the so-called Gang of Six, the Gang of Six was much larger than that. We actually had 46 senators and 100 House members. I think we can put together a plan, which perhaps today or at other points we can talk about, where everyone has a bit of a skin in the game, and we create, in a sense, the equivalent of what we've dealt with in the past when we had war bond campaigns. We need the 21st century equivalent of a war bond campaign where every American has a little bit of skin in the game so that we can get our balance sheet headed back in the right direction and America can continue to make the investments to grow our economy and maintain the kind of force protection we need to keep this world safe. So thank you very much for the opportunity to come here this morning, and I look forward now to the conversation and questions. Thank you all. Which one here? I like particular planning here when they give me a name tag on my seat. So that's
We get it logistically right. So, Senator Warner, thank you very much. Those were very, very important statements on a number of factors. We've got just short of 15 minutes for questions, so I'll lay out a couple of quick ones, and then we'll do quick Q&A back and forth. Just on Ukraine, could you just say very clearly, are you disappointed in the administration's response thus far? And if so, why? What do you think one should be doing differently?
I think on the energy side, I am disappointed that there is not a recognition that, particularly on the natural gas exporting permits, that we could have moved quicker, send a long-term answer that we're going to decouple the European, Ukrainian dependence upon Russian energy supplies. Recognizing that passing these export permits today isn't going to change the circumstance overnight. It will be a multi-year process before the facilities are built and the retrofitting of some of the ships to carry the LNG is possible. But I think it would have made a, much more dramatic statement if we'd moved there. In terms of the specific sanctions, I do believe, I understand the president's position that you've got to have room to escalate, but if you put it all out at once, there's no further room for negotiating. But the derision by which the original sanctions were granted from Russia sure did not seem to indicate the desired effect in terms of saying, hey, we need to back off. Now, we have to recognize that the sanctions have to be done in collaboration with our European allies. And while it's easy for us to say, let's go after the 200 oligarchs who are the major financial sources that directly or indirectly support Mr. Putin, and let's cut them all off at once, perhaps easy for us to say that when most of their money is actually in London and not in New York. We do need to find ways to do this in concert with our European allies. But I do believe that we need I think these next few weeks are extraordinarily critical because of the absolute readiness of some of the Russian troops and their ability to maintain that state of readiness will at some point degrade fairly shortly. So something, we could either see escalation or de-escalation very quickly. And again, the next few weeks are going to be key.
They have to use them or lose the chance to use them. Question on that. I find your call for the loosening of export permits, the enabling of export of gas, it is right that it wouldn't hit right away, but in the market sense, it would. It would have an impact on futures. It would have an impact on hedge funds toward Russia, et cetera, et cetera. What stands in the way of this? Your legislation that you're pushing, executive orders, is it a reluctance to have our gas go elsewhere? In other words, to keep the prices down here? What is actually standing in the way of this?
Well, there are certain American companies who have argued quite strenuously that we ought to keep our gas here, and that maintains potentially an artificially low price. I believe in the market. I believe this is a commodity spreading around the world will help increase American jobs. I think it will not. I think it will actually increase American security. I think it will allow us to open up other markets that may lead, again, to further trade opportunities. I think they need to move quicker. I think, again, beyond my pay grade to make this recommendation, I would also urge the President to go ahead and approve the Keystone Pipeline during this time frame as well. Not directly related, but would seem to me to send a strong signal that the dramatic transformation, probably the single most dramatic transformation economically, has been the fact that North America's, the view of North America as an energy producer has changed so radically over the last 8 or 9 years. And we need to take advantage of that from built into our security framework. And that's one of the reasons why I think there are short-term things we could do, such as the part of the aid package being tied into energy efficiency, energy productivity in Ukraine, further exploration of the ability, and this is, again, beyond my knowledge level, but I've seen it written about sometimes, of whether even in the event of an emergency, the pipelines that pass through Ukraine, whether the gas flows could actually be reversed, so that if there was a crisis and Russia did a dramatic stoppage of the gas, whether we could get supplies from Europe back into Ukraine to make sure that there wouldn't be a complete energy collapse should Russia take extreme actions.
Thank you, Senator. Harlan Ullman, I'll look for other questions as well.
And I'll try to do this in lightning round fashion. As a senator, it's hard for me to give short answers, but I'll try to do my best.
Senator, I'm Harlan Ullman. Thank you very much for your comments and your rationality. It's refreshing. I wanted to pass on to you a couple of questions that very senior members of a number of European governments and parliaments have asked me, and I don't expect you to answer them, but you might just want to take them aboard. First, supposing a majority of Ukrainian people would prefer siding with Russia, and what you're seeing in Kiev is really a minority of a minority, how would our policies be different? Second, you talk about energy exports and oil and natural gas. We don't have the port facilities to do that, so what are the plans for doing that? And finally, in terms of this administration, there are great criticisms about not sending missiles to Europe, but we are sending missiles to Poland and to Romania. Why has nobody made that case?
Let me take all those back for consideration. And, you know, there are, but I got a very interesting ethnic breakdown map of Ukraine yesterday. And I think one of the interesting things, even within Crimea, that I never could get an answer. You know, popular press put out that even within Crimea, only 58% were actually Russian nationals. Now, people spoke Russian, I think about 75, 80%. You know, we saw the challenges amongst the Tatar population, but that other 30% of perhaps mixed Ukrainian and Russian, you know, you heard very little in terms of their views. There are pockets of Russian ethnic majority, but I think there are really open questions even within those pockets of whether there would want to be full affiliation. If you go down the route, though, of willy-nilly opening up Europe to a series of regional plebiscites, I don't know how you just stop with Ukraine. And it would be curious to see whether Russia would extend that same opportunity to parts of their nation where there are minorities within the Russian territorial integrity.
Chechnya, Dagestan.
Amen.
Sort of, yeah. Please, I see a question in the back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Warner. My name is Jeannie Nguyen. I'm from Virginia, and I thank our our former governor who's made Virginia very strong.
Thank
and
you.
I thank everything you've done for Virginia. And I also thank you for being in the Gang of Six and leading us in the budget. The question is very clear that I believe in the balanced approach, and you talk about the moral, economical, and military strength, and you also later added in the political strength. So that political we rest on your capability to move the Senate. So my question has to do with what do you think about the TPA, the TPP, and if there's a chance that the Senate would come back and vote on ratifications of the UNCLOS and revoke or repeal the sequestrations. There seems to be a lot of policies in order that I believe that these policies are important. They have been on the table of the Senate, and in this critical time, can the Senate move faster and get them done? Because that would send a significant message to the international community, especially to Russia and to China.
Right.
Thank you.
This is a great question, and this is something we've been arguing at the Atlantic Council, that when you take TTIP and TPP together, this may be actually the most important geopolitical response for the 21st century in terms of how we get ourselves together and make sure that our view of how things ought to be conducted on the world stage. What is your answer to this?
Let me try to take them in reverse order. First of all, in terms of eliminating sequestration, I believe that when the threat of sequestration comes roaring back, there will be another window for whatever we want to call it, the sensible center, the rational folks, or just the people who could read a balance sheet in both parties, and to recognize the revenue side and the entitlement side. I honestly believe starting to make a breakthrough on the revenue side is harder than the entitlement side because of the I think it's been a challenge in both political parties. I frankly think it's been harder to be a Republican the last few years because of some of the orthodoxy around things like revenues. I think that's starting to change. It becomes, and I could completely bore you about why 18.6% on a 50-year run rate on revenues cannot fund the enterprise we've got right now, beyond the fact that at 18.6 we never balance the budget. The only time we've ever had a balanced budget in the last 75 years has been revenues and expenditures between 19.5% and 21% of our GDP. But that'll be another discussion. So I think there's some hopefully greater rationality. We missed an opportunity yesterday, which I voted against. You know, I've learned business accounting, I've learned state government accounting, but neither one of them can hold a candle to federal government accounting. We had something called the doc fix, the SGR. We had a chance yesterday to get rid of the doc fix and also, with all due respect, get rid of OCO. One phony item, budget item for another phony budget item, and at least start to clear the decks. We instead went ahead and did another one-year patch. I voted against that. On TPA and both the European and the TPP, one of the things, again, step back, I'm a recent new addition to the Finance Committee. And it's been remarkable, only being on the committee for less than a month, how many people think I'm smarter and taller and handsomer now just because I happen to be on that. I didn't fully appreciate the value of being on the committee until now. But I believe very strongly that America can be successful in a global trading environment. And since 95% of all the new customers in the world are not domestic America, that we ought to be doing that. The challenge is that we've got now around these agreements, not just traditional folks on the Democratic side who are rising up against it, but a kind of a new group on the Republican side who's anti-trade as well. And I think it is incumbent upon the administration, let's even before we get to TPA, let's go to just TPP for a moment. The president, I think, has made good comments saying, particularly vis-a-vis TPP, that this is different than the old bilateral trade agreements. This is a brand new approach in terms of labor, environmental standards, government standards. I think, I'm not sure this is a PC way to describe it, he needs to show a little more leg to convince, show a little more details to convince members in both parties that this is a more level playing field if we're going to be able to kind of generate the ability to get to TPA this year.
And for those who are not all in with the acronyms, the Trans-Pacific Partnership as the trade deal and trade promotion authority is what would enhance the ability to get down. Last question. I thought, did you have a question here? No? I'm going to tick in the order
I can do
I
two
saw.
if I'll do them quickly.
Okay, we'll take one here, and this was the next gentleman I saw. So let's just take these last two.
Good morning. My name is Dolores Newson, and I'm with the Yellow Group. And you said the way to fix the budget was to deal with taxes, and the other was to deal with a reform entitlements. So how would you reform Medicare and Social Security?
Well, let me give you. If you go back to the Simpson Bowles and Gang of Six, there's about 12 or 15 specific items. But let me just cite two. I tried this out. I road test all these things. Whenever I'm out talking to a group, particularly a group of young folks, I've yet to find any group of young folks that are, say, under 40, that if I say, if we had to move the time you got Social Security from, say, 67 to 68 or 69, and you actually had a shot of getting it, how many of you would agree to that further extension on the age, recognizing that would give you 20 or 30 years to plan? I get 95 to 98% of all the young folks saying, absolutely, sign me up. I think one of the things that I find disheartening, not disheartening, that's the wrong word, frustrating, from a progressive side, is somebody I've been very blessed. I had a lot of business success before I went into government. I don't know how you can argue as a progressive that it's fair for me not to chip in a little bit more on Medicare when we have poverty rates at about 8% amongst seniors in America today, yet 24% amongst children, which is almost a reversal on a percentage basis to where the percentages were in the 60s when we desperately needed Medicare. Medicare is a wonderful promise. It ought to be kept. But I think that what we are doing to our children, we want America to be economically strong. When we have 24% of our children in poverty, when we're seeing on a glide path right now that would cut any domestic assistance on terms of early childhood education, other thing, by about 75% over 12 years, I will take on with the most progressive individual around what's progressive about that system. Because when so much of our budget is on automatic pilot without any review, and the only place that gets reviewed is support for our military and support for what in Washington speak called domestic discretionary, that is not a great way to run an enterprise as great as our country. And what makes it even worse, particularly when we think this is even more so on the military side than on the domestic discretionary side, but when we go through the stupidity of running the largest enterprise in the world, the federal government, on 3 and 6 and 9-month continuing resolutions, if the American public realized how much money we lose by starting and stopping contracts as many times, they would even be angrier than they are. So let's go ahead and bite the bullet. Let's recognize, and on the tax side, let me be clear. I don't believe it can, I believe in a progressive tax system. I've been very blessed. I don't believe you can get it all in terms of what we need out of simply the top 1%. I'm willing to pay more, but there needs to be a broader-based approach where, frankly, everyone has at least some skin in the game. And if there is ever an idea, for example, I've floated ideas around a debt reduction surcharge that would go into a segregated account that could only be paid down for, for interest or debt reduction. Something where, again, we rally the American people around a common cause. What the nation needs, in my belief right now, is a little less of the kind of blame game approach and a little more of, hey, we're all in it together. And I think there is the ability to find that common ground on. And those are just two examples of where I can give you a menu of 10, and we could argue about which ones we ought to take.
Senator, I know you're out of time, but we promised this gentleman one last question, so please.
Thank you. I'm Gerald Chandler, and thank you. I really appreciate your remarks, and you said a lot of things that I think need to be said. My question is about Iran. What have we learned from what Russia has done that should influence with Iran? Can we trust Russia to help us in Iran? Can we trust Iran to act reasonably, since we see that Russia doesn't act reasonably? Should we up our efforts right now in Iran, or should we wait, as the president is doing, to see what happens 6 months from now?
And I guess this puts your Intel Committee hat on a little bit, because it's not just Iran, Syria. What impacts are there elsewhere from this Russian situation?
I'm not going to give you much of an answer because I take my responsibility very seriously about being on Intel. I would simply say that I think all these items are interconnected, and I was someone who said we need to keep the threat of the additional sanctions. I was supportive of Menendez-Kirk because I felt like we needed to keep that threat very much on the table. I think that threat needs to stay on the table, and we need to see tangible action. Let me close with one. We've made a lot of serious comments here, and just one thing that maybe puts this all a little bit in perspective. With the weighty issues we've discussed, about a month ago, I was coming to work and was doing a radio interview with a radio station down in Virginia Beach. Obviously, a lot of military presence there, Navy and the budget. And a radio interview I'd done a number of times with this fellow, and he asked me about the Navy. He asked me about the budget. And then I have to acknowledge he asked me a question I hadn't been asked before. He said, Senator, what do you think, and this being an international focused audience, I think you'll appreciate it. Fred, he said, Senator, what do you think about these efforts to deport Justin Bieber? And I thought for a moment, I said, I don't know as a senator, but as the father of 3 daughters from 19 to 24, where do I sign? And the point is, and this is kind of like, it's an interesting job I have. I had to go to a hearing and give a speech. It took me about 2.5 hours to get actually into the office. And I get into the office, and my office is exploding. People running around, the phones are ringing off the hook. My press guy goes, TMZ, DMZ, Entertainment Tonight. They said in 2.5 hours, we've had more press inquiries on Justin Bieber than 5 years of your work on the budget.
Well,
I'm not sure where that leads, but it does say.
Well, it leads to this session getting many more page views. So we really want to thank you for that. So on behalf of the audience, let me just hit 3 things, and I know that the senator has to get somewhere quickly. So if you'll give him a chance to do that too after we close. But first of all, your clarity of speech, vision, articulation on issues of energy, issues of Ukraine, issues of budget. I, for one, I think the audience joins me in this, like it that a politician knows the numbers and understands the numbers, so thank you for using them. And I'm also happy to have you serve on just as many gangs as you'd like to get the job done, so thank you so much.